Good day, and thank you for attending our session. In this presentation, we will talk about terrestrial analogs of space exploration and how these can be adapted to address research questions related to socio-behavioral challenges we might encounter in our efforts to establish a permanent human presence on Mars. Space mission operational parameters have always defined analog operational concepts. For instance, simulating moonwalks and rock sample collection during Apollo-era analogs, simulating conditions of microgravity through the underwater NEMO analog, simulating a return trip to Mars through the Mars 500 analog, or simulating months-long stays on Mars for teams of up to 6 persons through high seas and MDRS, and simulating use of vehicles in Mars surface exploration through the FMARS analog. Much has been investigated and learned through such analogs. How to deal with space mission practical constraints while conducting routine operations, such as collecting samples while wearing a spacesuit, or how to counter astronization, which is an observed phenomenon of physical and cognitive weakening during space missions, through physical and cognitive activity, or how to prevent maladaptive social processes such as scapegoating, crew-ground intergroup tension, and within-crew tensions through cognitive behavior therapy and social skills training. However, all such analogs have been based on an operational concept that revolves around exploration by a small group of highly specialized scientists and astronauts in the context of a limited duration, at most month-long mission, eventually dismantling their base and returning to Earth. So the question arises here, are such analog missions still informative in the context of efforts to conceptualize and plan for more populous and persistent bases on the Moon or Mars, where the objective will not just be to explore and live, but to permanently settle and establish a second home for humanity? Now, of course, if we are going to start setting up analogs that correspond to the expected operational parameters of a permanent space settlement, for instance, on the surface of Mars, we first need to have an understanding of those operational parameters. And of course, that is a challenge because the conceptual work for the design of such settlements is only now being done. Now, thankfully, what we do have the recent Mars Society Colony Design Contest, which was an excellent source of information to extract operational parameters for large-scale space settlements. Specifically, what we did was a thematic analysis of the 22 finalist papers from the Mars Society's Colony Design Contest. Just to say a couple of words about this contest, the contest invited submissions of technical papers for the establishment of the first human city on Mars with a population of 1,000 residents. This was judged by a team of 10 space industry experts. This was in October of 2019, including judges from NASA and from SpaceX. And papers were scored on technical merit, economic viability, social system design, governance, and aesthetics. A total of 100 submissions were received from teams around the world. And the 22 finalists, so the 22 papers that received the highest scores from essentially from 10 reviewers, were invited to publish their technical paper in an edited volume, from which the data for this study on large-scale space settlement design was extracted through inductive thematic analysis. So what would be the concept of operations in such large-scale space settlements as conceptualized through the Mars Society Colony Design Contest? Well, interestingly, what the thematic analysis showed was that there was actually quite a lot of convergence between the finalist concepts, at least in terms of some core parameters. Of course, there were of course many differences, but I think what was more striking was the convergence rather than the difference. And let us go through through these convergences, through these converging operational parameters one by one. So, regarding the habitation concept, well, what was interesting was that all top five finalist concepts recommend some type of burrowing underground for the initial settlement. So, for instance, one idea is subtractive construction with tunnels around the crater rim. That was actually our own concept, which was the first place winning concept, and which you can see to the left in this image. Excavating into the sides of mesas or canyons, or building inside a sealed lava tube, or constructing a partially submerged surface town with underground connectivity between buildings. So what we are not seeing is this earth bias design of building little houses on the ground and just covering the whole thing with a dome. That's not what we saw in winning concepts. Instead, we saw that at least for the initial stage, burrowing underground for protection would be the sensible way to go. Now, regarding resources, all of the concepts, all 22 of them, I would say, um, describe some sort of process of in situ resource utilization. So the assumption is that various mining and chemical engineering processes would be utilized to locally produce all essential materials, oxygen, water, steel, glass, fuel, plastics, etc. None of these basic materials would be imported on an ongoing basis from Earth. They would have to be produced locally for this whole project to be sustainable in the long term. And something similar, of course, applies for food production. All concepts assume that the vast majority of edible foods will be produced locally. So some suggestions range from different mixtures of hydroponic, aquaponic, or aeroponic farming to insect farming, most typically cricket farming there, raising small animals, most typically that would be chicken, and breeding resilient small fish species. And tilapia was mentioned quite frequently in the different concepts. So what we definitely don't see is large animals. This was very rarely mentioned. But this idea of finding efficient ways to, especially to produce reliable sources of protein that would meet the requirements of a diverse diet, and doing that all locally was very much present across all the concepts. Regarding energy sources, the majority of concepts recommend using nuclear power, which seems to be the most pragmatic and realistic option. But that would be backed up by various supplementary energy sources, especially solar and wind, which could complement each other uh, uh, with solar being more useful in when there are no sunstorms and wind being the opposite. Some mention also geothermal and other energy sources, but really at the core would be seems to be a core requirement for nuclear energy to cover most of the needs of the settlement. Two-way trade between Mars and Earth. That seems to be an assumption um, in most concepts that there will continue to be dependence on Earth, especially for complex equipment and consumables. So, for instance, microchips, medicines, nuclear reactors, though also some luxury foods were mentioned in this category that wouldn't fall in the above categories as material that would be imported on an ongoing basis from Earth. But really, it's about the essentials of an advanced technological society where you just don't have the economies of scale on Mars to produce locally. And in return, the Mars colony will export a wide variety of goods and services back to Earth, but certainly not low-value common ores, because there would never be an economic rationale for doing that especially when you factor in the transportation costs. So, but it could be anything from Martian art to having a knowledge economy on Mars that would that would then lead to patents that could generate royalties back on Earth, etc. Regarding socio-cultural development, and this is, I think, is the most important aspect especially for this presentation. All concepts assume that while some people will be returning to Earth after a few years, the majority of participants will be staying on Mars permanently. starting families there, and raising new generations with a uniquely Martian sociocultural identity and outlook, who will eventually govern their own affairs through some type of autonomous territory status or even some type of sovereign state status. So that's where it becomes really very different from anything we have done in space before. Space in the past has always been about taking people to space for an expedition and then bringing them back to their sociocultural environment. But here we're talking about the creation of a totally new sociocultural context. So when we compare these emerging concept of operations within the context of a large and permanent and populous space settlement, there are some similarities, but also notable differences when contrasted against conventional space missions. So, first of all, the similarities include isolation from family and friends on Earth, um, microgravity, exposure to solar radiation that needs to be protected against, extreme dependence on technological closed-loop life support systems, and of course, the critical importance of preventing mental health problems and ensuring collaboration. Well, and as for the differences, first of all, in a conventional space mission, you would have a single cohesive small team, whereas in a large-scale space settlement, inevitably you're going to have multiple teams, to say the least, each developing their own distinct group identity over time. Um, in a classical space mission, mission duration is from weeks to months, whereas here, in a persistent settlement, individuals will be spending from years to maybe even the remainder of their lives. Um, in a classical space mission, almost all parameters are predefined by mission control on Earth, whereas in the context of a large-scale space settlement, you would expect that there would be increasing autonomy at all levels of decision making, um, which would require flexibility to adapt as circumstances change. So incidentally, we're already seeing a shift in wording. So when it comes to such missions, already people are talking about mission support as opposed to mission control, which is a recognition of this reality that especially with at such distances, but also given the magnitude of the task, it will not be possible to possible or desirable to control such an enterprise remotely. In classical space missions, almost all life necessities are pre-manufactured on Earth. Whereas in a large-scale space settlement, you would expect that in situ resource utilization would be the basis for manufacturing all building materials and securing supplies of oxygen, food, water, and energy. Otherwise, this cannot be sustainable in the longer term. And finally, and most very importantly, in classical space missions, parameters revolve around specific projectized and time-bound scientific objectives. Whereas in a large-scale space settlement, what we have is a more open-ended community development project as an end in itself, with children born in space as the ultimate expression of such aspirations. So it's going to be much more than just doing science in space. It's going to be world community building and world building in space, which is a totally different story. So, with this concept of operations in mind for large-scale space settlement, what should be the design principles and parameter for an analog that would be faithful to the requirements of such large-scale space settlements? First of all, the analog itself would have to be populous. So instead of doing an analog with 5 to 7 participants, as most human system as analogs for space are until today, the analog would need to start with 50 to 100 participants. Otherwise, it wouldn't be reflecting the realities of large-scale space settlements. The analog would have to be multi-team. So instead of getting a single cohesive unit living together in the same enclosed location, as they do, for instance, in the MDRS and high seas and the FMARS analogs, participants would have to be spread across smaller habitation and work units in a wider geographical locale, which will simulate the space settlement. Also, the analog would have to be growth-oriented. Instead of focusing on implementing science projects within prefabricated habitations, Analog participants would focus on expanding habitable space, increasing life support capacity, and nurturing an evolving sense of community and identity. Uh, in corollary to this, the analog would have to be cumulative. Otherwise, it cannot be growth oriented. And what do I mean here? So instead of having everything be reset when a new mission team comes in, as happens with most analogs until this day, each new cohort would be building on the development projects already established by previous cohorts. So, for instance, if the previous cohort established a habitation for 50 people, that would be where the next cohort starts, and maybe they would think about further advancing ISRU processes. And when they have advanced the in-situ resource utilization, maybe the next cohorts can think more about providing entertainment options, just to give some examples here. But it would have to be cumulative. We would have to simulate this process of an accumulating growth in the design of the colony. There should also be heterogeneity in mission commencement and duration. So instead of having all participants join and leave the mission at the same time, participants would arrive at different times to join existing teams, while the duration of their stay would also differ. Um, and finally, the analog should be semi-connected. So instead of being physically disconnected from Earth for the duration of the simulation, there should be limited two-way trade incorporated into the analog, with Earth regularly sending essential resources to the analog, which would in turn send back its own exports. And this would be a more realistic simulation of an Earth-Mars of the Earth-Mars economy that will need to come into existence to sustain such a large-scale settlement project. Now, before we proceed, it would be helpful if we make a distinction between low fidelity and high fidelity uh, space settlement analogs. And when a low fidelity analog would be volunteer and student oriented camps, but still following a common methodology and metrics to enable comparability of findings. It it should not require an extreme environment. One shouldn't feel that they need to go to the Arctic to establish such an analog. In fact, it can be established in any semi-remote locale. For instance, in the countryside, 30 to 50 kilometers from a local university, from which volunteer participants can join. So this kind of practical approach to locating the analog, of course, it would have to be in an uninhabited location. But other than that, there should be a practicality in the selection of the locale. There should be at least 50 participants, even in low fidelity analogs, separated into several habitation and work teams. And what the low fidelity analog should do is basic simulation of in situ resource utilization, for instance, baking bricks to build huts, setting up small scale hydroponic farming, but also simulating the initial dependence on supplies from the ground by using food, fuel, and electricity generators that were imported into the analog. So such a low fidelity analog, which wouldn't require much in terms of funding, it would require a lot in terms of planning and commitment, of course, but not much in terms of funding um, or multi-year commitments. But it can be used to provide initial socio-behavioral data as well as to refine socio-behavioral research methods in preparation for the design of more expensive high-fidelity analogs as will be described below. So, in contrast, high-fidelity analogs would need to be well-funded, i.e. in the tens of millions of dollars. They would have to be built in isolated, extreme, preferably very cold environments, such as in Mongolia or Siberia or in northern Canada. Maybe Devon Island, the site of Houghton Crater, would be actually quite a good place to, where there's already quite a lot of simulation work taking place there. Maybe that would be a good place for a high fidelity analog. High fidelity analogs would need to be persistent and cumulative multi-year projects with participants staying from months to years. They would start with about 50 participants, but gradually grow maybe into the hundreds or possibly thousands if we are really serious about simulating what the emergence of a settlement on Mars would look like. The analog would be a multidisciplinary effort. So it wouldn't just be about socio-behavioral human systems. It should be an opportunity to test all of the engineering, ecological, and human systems and their reciprocal interactions before implementing them on Mars. So, can we create, for instance, biomass to a sufficient extent within such a closed system? Do we have the right equipment in order to drill for ice or to generate oxygen from carbon dioxide? So all of these technical questions that are being addressed through several small projects, the high fidelity analog would be an opportunity to put it all in practice alongside a realistic simulation of human systems to see how it all comes together. And of course, the simulation of in situ resource utilization must be as realistic as possible. For instance, dumping regolith simulant in the vicinity of the analog for use by the participants, using tunnelers for subterranean construction, powering the base via a portable nuclear generator, etc. Now, needless to say, we're several years away from being ready for such high fidelity analogs, and definitely the priority now should be to get started as soon as possible with low fidelity analogs as described earlier. So depending on whether we're designing a low fidelity socio-behavioral analog or a high fidelity full mission analog, the features that we would be building in to approximate the expected features of large scale space settlements would differ accordingly. So for instance, we expect that we will be arriving on Mars on numerous starships after a months-long journey. So in a low fidelity analog, participants can arrive in large buses, taking several days to arrive at the analog locations, with participants camping around their bus overnight. That would be the low fidelity version. Whereas in the high fidelity version, you can have an initial journey phase emulated by having the participants cohabitate in mock starships for several months before actually being allowed out on the surface of Mars, so-called surface of Mars within the analog. Subtractive construction of initial habitats, which would be another feature of a large-scale space settlement. Well, in a low-fidelity analog, simply what you can do is use basic hand tools and portable machine tools to partially submerge surface huts and or partially build huts into the side of hills. Not fully, I'm not saying about building a cave, making a cave, but somehow burrowing in to an extent and then maybe completing the rest of the hut with in the usual manner. But anything to emulate this sense of burrowing into the ground. Whereas in a high fidelity analog, you would use large full electric diggers and tunnelers operated in full sim, so wearing simulated spacesuits, to construct habitats that are fully underground or in tunnels. So that would be a more realistic representation of what we can expect to do. And that's for the ISRU processes to generate oxygen, water, concrete, steel, glass, plastics, and fuel. That's what we will be expecting to do on Mars. Well, in a low fidelity analog, you can do very simple, if you like, almost medieval kind of ISRU activities, such as baking bricks from soil, forging steel in a foundry, diverting water supplies from a nearby natural source. And the emphasis here would not so much be on the fidelity of the resource utilization process, but more on monitoring the behavioral adaptation of participants to challenges that they encounter in ISRU and in how they manage to collaborate to address this. Whereas in a high fidelity analog, there would be full range ISRU testing the actual technical systems and processes which will eventually be used on Mars. And that can continue like that. Large-scale space settlements will rely on nuclear, but the low-fidelity analog electricity generators and photovoltaic solar panels would do for a low-fidelity analog. But we would want to go nuclear in a high-fidelity full-mission analog if we're going to be serious about actually testing all the systems that will be put in place on Mars. As for farming, on Mars we expect to be involved in extensive hydroponic, aquaponic, and aeroponic farming, chicken, tilapia, crickets, as already discussed. Well, we can do in the low fidelity analog basic hydroponics and chicken farming. Again, the emphasis should be on monitoring the behavioral adaptation to food production challenges. Whereas in the high fidelity analog, we would be actually be testing the ecological systems and processes which will eventually be used on Mars and actually carefully monitoring the food yield against expected budgeted food yield and looking at the whole socio-technical system leading to food production. Um, in a large-scale space settlement, we expect to have a multi-communal society with emerging identities and intergroup processes within the colony. We can actually simulate that quite well, even in a low-fidelity analog, except maybe the issue of time, because we wouldn't have them in sim for years. In a low-fidelity analog, it would probably be a shorter duration than that. But we can have a multi-group configuration, which will enable the simulation of intergroup processes. Whereas in a high fidelity analog, um, multiple communities, each with their own emergent culture, would gradually emerge and evolve within the colony over the life of the simulation. A space settlement will be permanent and multi-generational, with each generation building on the work of predecessors. Now, even in a low fidelity analog, we should aim for the analog to persist over at least 1 year, but possibly divided into generations of participants, staying about 3 months each before handing over. It doesn't have to be precise because we do want new entrants to meet existing entrants. So maybe some people can stay for 6 months, while others come in at the third month, so that we simulate all of these challenges of transition. Because we do want to see what the transition process looks like when a second generation comes in and finds already a half-built settlement. How does that work? Now, in a high fidelity analog, the analog should persist over at least, I don't know, 5 years, divided into generations of participants, staying 1 to 2 years each before handing over. That would be a much more realistic representation of what the settlement on Mars would look like, where you wouldn't expect people to be coming or going more frequently than once every couple of years when the travel conditions from Earth to Mars are favorable. Now, of course, we wouldn't be establishing such analogs just to play that we're living on Mars. We are doing them to answer specific research questions. Now, in this case, socio-behavioral research questions, and acquire the knowledge that we need in order to be ready to get things right on Mars the first time. So what are some research questions that we would be able to address in such analog environments, whether it's the low fidelity or the high fidelity version? First of all, we will be able to address questions related to intergroup collaboration. What will be the quality of interaction between different teams? How would changing the total number of teams, their geographical proximity, their composition, and their levels of interdependence impact on the quality of their collaboration and the overall social cohesion of the settlement? Then we will have all sorts of questions related to skills and competencies. And given the requirements for autonomous decision making and collaboration across multiple teams, and the daily life that will revolve around in situ resource utilization, as well as the pursuit of happiness in a challenging environment, what would be the optimal mixture of transversal life skills and task-specific competencies, which would maximize productivity, peacefulness, and well-being? So that's a very complex and highly packed question that will need to be carefully uh, broken down into its constituents so that it can be experimentally tested. Um, then there is the issue of sense making. Given the open-ended nature of a project focused on community emergence on another planet, how would analog participants construct meaning and develop a sense of purpose as time goes on? What will the transition to self-expression look like after they have addressed basic survival necessities? Because every community eventually evolves from survival to self-expression. That's a fundamental tenet of cultural psychology. So what would that look like on Mars? And how would life be made meaningful there? And not just fun and tolerable and survivable? And how will these issues be negotiated within the analog? Then, of course, there's the issue of resilience. So how will individuals and team address actual or scenario simulated adversities while the analog is ongoing? So, for instance, how will they deal with a breakdown of specific resource utilization processes? How would they deal with within group or between group polarization? How would they deal with a breakdown of ground analog trade routes? So what resources would they utilize in their own selves, in their relationships, in their using the machinery that they have, and using their environment to address such challenges? And a final word about behavioral research methods within the analog environment. First of all, what types of data would we be collecting before, during, and after participation in the analog? Well, self-report and peer-report rating scales would be very important in investigating all sorts of relevant variables. Psychophysiological data and mobility tracking through wearable devices. Experience sampling via surveys pushed to mobile devices at various times during the day would provide a real-time measurement of mood, psychological state, skills activation, and various other parameters that we'll be interested in. Production metrics. So, for instance, how many hats were built, how much food was produced, will also be very important in all sorts of different predictive models, where we will be looking to correlate socio-behavioral parameters with survivability outcomes, and event data. For instance, how many conflict events occurred, how many social gatherings took place. Now, as for analytic strategies, so what we do with this data once we have gotten it, well, there's a lot we can learn here from existing research on analogs. So, for instance, we know there are already excellent best practices from the high seas analog in terms of exploring causal pathways and developmental trajectories through analysis of longitudinal data. So if we think of every participant as giving us data points over time, several data points every day on all sorts of issues, and then the next day and the next day and the next week. And we also get data on production metrics, maybe at the group level. And so you can imagine how we can use all of this rich data to develop an understanding of causal pathways. So when something happens on one day, something else is more likely to happen the next day. So these are crucially important types of analysis that we would need to be conducting. And something that is probably going to be more unique to this large-scale settlement setup that is not analyzed in existing analogs is monitoring phenomena and influences across multiple system scales. Because of course we will have multiple system scales, the individual level, the household level, the community level, the settlement-wide institution. So how does one level, how do emerging properties of one level affect the emergence of properties on another level? So how does the acquisition of skills at the level of the participants affect the functioning of institutions at the level of one of the communities as a whole? Um, and another analytic strategy, which of course is going to be very important as we move towards the um, utilizing the data from the analog, is to take the observation data from the analog to initialize and calibrate computer simulations. This is something that Bill Clancy and others have already demonstrated at FMARS, where they took detailed measures of their daily interactions, and then they just plugged the whole thing into a Sims-like game environment where you could actually see how the um, and experiment in a computer environment on possible scenarios regarding the further development of the settlement. So, how does all this contribute to our ultimate objective of uh, establishing permanent human presence on the surface of Mars? Um, the different low fidelity analogs, whether it's a socio-behavioral low fidelity analog, whether it's an ecological analog, such as the Melissa program or Biosphere 2, which is another ecological analog, where you test the closed loop biological systems, or technological analogs where you test drilling equipment. All of that can be tested separately over the next few years, until each subsystem is ready, and then it can all be put together in the context of a high fidelity full mission analog. The data that would be generated from that would enable the design of detailed operational parameters for an actual mission to Mars. Plus, the analog can serve as the training ground for astronauts, and not just astronauts really, but should I say settlers, future residents of Mars, who can become familiarized with what they will expect to find once they land on Mars by participating in the analog. And from there on, it's about using starships and other such traveling systems as will be available at the time in order to make the trip to Mars. So um, analogs are going to be an important bridge, just like analogs in the desert were an important stepping stone to putting people on the moon back in the 1960s. So will analogs, as described in this presentation, be a crucial stepping stone in establishing a permanent human presence on Mars. So thank you very much for your attention. If you would like to learn more about large-scale space settlement analogs and emerging thinking around that, please feel free to reach out to us. You can find our contact email at the first slide of this presentation. Thank you very much.